David, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So we're in a moment right now where obviously the Democratic Party is dealing with a lot of issues within the party. New polling is showing that the party more broadly is as unpopular as a lot of polling has ever shown it to be. And so in a moment where, your job is to talk to folks about what's happening in this country, especially as it relates to the worst successes of the Trump administration, how do you kind of keep the faith when there really seems to be backsliding against what you've been advocating for?
Couple different things. I mean, number one, when parties have lost everything and the robust opposition phase is only beginning, it's not a huge shock that support would be low.
Yeah.
I think the continuing resolution fiasco probably did not help, certainly. But for me, the light at the end of the tunnel is that people do seem to be connecting now how policy leads to events in people's lives. And a couple of the stories were almost really gifts from Trump's deportation plan. There was this man votes Trump, Trump deports his wife
Right.
story. And then we had this other one, man votes Trump, Trump's ICE imprisons his wife story. And I do think that these stories are really starting to tell that the left needs to connect policy to real world consequences, so it seems less like sport and less about whether you like certain personalities. And then finally, the other thing that I've been talking about, and I think to some degree, you and I have spoken about it, which is figuring out which candidates genuinely are what voters want, rather than taking a candidate and trying to change them into what voters want, which comes off as so disingenuous. I'm hoping that the search for 2028 and 2026 is going to focus more on finding someone that's the right person already.
Are there any names that you've seen floated? And I know that, for example, before Barack Obama came onto the scene, nobody really knew who Barack Obama was. I mean, other than the folks who knew that he was a junior senator from Illinois. But right now, I mean, it does feel like we have the same cast of characters that just kind of get recycled into different spots. Is anybody who you're looking at, whether it's big names for 2026 or bigger names for 2028, somebody who already exists in the zeitgeist? Or do you presume that we're going to see folks come in that we don't even know necessarily yet?
I'm not big on predictions
Yeah.
because they're usually worth what you pay for them. But a couple things I will say is I'm very interested in seeing how the future of folks like Josh Shapiro and very separately Congresswoman AOC develop over the next 2 years. And I don't say that because I think these are the leaders of the Democratic Party right now. But what I'm curious to see is how does public perception of their role on the political spectrum develop over the next couple of years? Because there was a period where AOC was, she's way too far left and extreme. And all of a sudden, she's become more politically savvy. She has become more familiar with the way politics works. Some don't like it, but she's much more seriously being thought of as someone who now understands how you get power.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's been missing to a degree, Brian, which is how do you actually win elections and get power has become secondary or tertiary.
Right. To the adoption of maximalist positions or purity politics, which I think is, I mean, this is just my opinion, I think has kind of taken over from the actual just politics, making sure to get the most people in your tent and just find, I think there's this sense within the Democratic Party that we have to find people who really hit every single bucket, every single point that we need to hit. If not, we're perfectly content to attack them to the ends of the earth. But that's not going to help us win elections if we're just, chasing people by virtue of finding the politician who most closely accedes to all of our individual positions. I am curious, though, as we talk about this, what your thoughts are on left and right, like of the spectrum of progressive versus moderate, versus whether you think that's going to be the main thing, or something that I've been thinking about more, which is that it's not necessarily about progressive versus moderate, but more this idea of fighters versus non-fighters. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Well, you're picking up on something I've been talking about, which is the political spectrum, using the terms left and right to describe what it is people believe, their principles and their values, is pretty broken. And it's broken for a bunch of reasons. One, MAGA has totally broken it by taking these shape-shifting positions that if you applied them to the political standards of 30 years ago, some of this stuff would kind of qualify as left, some of it would qualify as right. You've got the populist angle where the populist rhetoric can be subverted by Republicans or Democrats. So as a way of describing people's beliefs, left and right just falls so short right now. And I think like a sort of matrix of where are you on economic populism and where are you on authoritarianism versus libertarianism in terms of how involved do you want government in different functions seems better and more dynamic in terms of describing people's beliefs. To your point, I don't think that there is really a world right now in which a list of 40 policy positions is the way to figure out who's the right candidate, at least not for the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
And, you know, we go back and look at those first 2 weeks of Kamala Harris's campaign. The speeches had energy. It was a different speech every day. They were doing the "these guys are weird" stuff, which was working well. They were attacking on all fronts. And all of a sudden, it was either the consultants or the strategists or the focus groups or who knows what. And it became too generic of a campaign, and that's where things went wrong. So I think that really needs to be a major area of focus.
Yeah, I mean, well, to that point, I mean, that really does kind of just, there are a lot of voices, I think, that really don't have a ton to show for themselves in the political era that we're living in right now, and those seem to be the people who have the ears of the folks who are working in politics. But again, you know, you and I have the luxury of being able to talk to people where we get instant feedback, and you spoke about this in the book as well. And I think that we're in a different era now where you know, what's worked in the past isn't necessarily working now in this social media era. So can you talk a little bit about what you've seen from our democratic politics versus like what you've seen from your own channel online?
Well, listen, there's been a major sea change, right? If we were talking 6 months ago, maybe even 4 months ago, I believe, had a different situation with regard to the engagement on platforms like ours. I'm cautiously optimistic that the Democratic Party is now starting to see the value, not of engaging with us October 20th or later of election years, right? But actually building an ecosystem, not that mirrors the disinformation that Trump so successfully spread in the last 6 months of the election, but of creating a community people want to be a part of. And we've talked about this with a lot of our co-creators as well. There was something about seeing Trump in this unstructured hangout format with the Nelk boys, with Rogan, with whoever, where it didn't matter that he told 100 lies an hour. It was more interesting as a community to be a part of than the hyper-structured 9-minute and someone's off camera saying you got to wrap up format, which a lot on the left have taken to. So I'm glad we're having this conversation today because I do see a change happening. And I think Democrats are getting that the community media aspect has to be built to keep people engaged.
So the Democrats are obviously seeing that this has to be built. Have you seen a difference in how they are actually, in whether they're actually abiding by that? Like, have you seen the Democrats kind of embrace this, or do you still think that there's a way to go to get to the point where they're willing to take that risk? Because I mean,
this is a big problem that you can't fix.
A lot of what we do see, to your exact point, is behavior that is safe, that is uncontroversial, that is, you know, maybe poll tested to reach the biggest swath of people while you know, upsetting no one. And so that kind of has been ingrained in Democrats' thinking and Democrats' behavior for as long as I can remember. Republicans left that by the wayside back in 2016. And so we're almost a decade into this experiment on the right where they are willing to be, you know, controversial and I mean, we've seen that to the nth degree, but Democrats largely won't. So I am curious then, now I'll let you speak, what you think about that.
Listen, as you pointed out, the right's been dabbling in this for nearly a decade.
Yeah.
Maybe since December, Democrats are trying a different approach. So no, it hasn't all been fixed.
Yeah.
And, you know, without naming names, some of my conversations with staffers still are, we want to talk to you 3 times before you do the interview. We're going to limit it to 10 and a half minutes. Here are the things we want you to talk about. Will you give us the questions in advance? Which, of course, I never do.
Yeah.
I'm being super upfront with these folks, Brian, and I know to a degree you are as well, in saying, let it happen. Get out of the way. These are professionals. These are elected officials. They're big boys and big girls. Allow them to just be part of the ecosystem. Allow them to actually have the freedom to say what's on their minds. Half of them are sort of acknowledging that this is what needs to happen, which, listen, it's way better than where we were 6 months ago. Yeah. But the risk aversion is very much still there.
One of the first things that I read in your book was Why You Hate Politics. Can you speak on that?
Yeah, it's the introduction. It's a little tongue-in-cheek, but the point I make is, when I think about engaging with politics, I think about the stuff that we talk about off-air, of how can we solve real problems. There are economic problems. There are issues with healthcare. There are infrastructure issues. These are the issues I would like to be grappling with when I say, hey, I care about what's happening politically in my community, in my country. Because of the debasement of who we are up against here, politics has become something deplorable, which is we're arguing with people over facts. We're arguing with people over, do human activities impact the climate? And I give a bunch of examples in the book, and what I hate about it is that you have to engage on that level first to even have a shot at any progress. And it's a really depressing place to be. And so that's the aspect of it that I hate.
And so how do you have the faith to keep on going, knowing that I mean, this goes back to my first question a little bit, but rather than being able to engage with everybody online on topics that actually matter, the fact that we're regressing, I mean, far from being able to have actually, informed conversations about what's going on, obviously with a shared sense of reality, we're now regressing to the point where the basic sense of reality, just truth, fact, reality, doesn't even exist anymore. And so how do you move forward in an environment that seems to be pulling you backwards?
My approach is to see the voters that have fallen for it really as victims. And when you see someone as a victim, you kind of feel bad for them, right? They have been victimized by a Republican Party that has chosen to contrive issues on which they feel they can get the upper hand. Men and women's sports, an issue that affects a fraction of a fraction of a fraction, which they've weaponized, and the left has been a little clumsy in dealing with it, right? They take that, and all of a sudden, no one's talking about the fact that there's a thing called medical bill bankruptcy in the United States that shouldn't exist, that there are kids who are hungry in the United States. That doesn't need to exist. That's optional. So the way I remain engaged is by realizing that there's a lot of people who have completely fallen for this propaganda. And in order to get them back, we've just got to connect with them how what they vote for impacts what happens in their immediate communities. And that men and women's sports are CRT, DEI, right? Who hears about CRT? Now it's just DEI. Right. This stuff is meant to pit us against each other, and it puts not a single dollar in their pocket.
Have you seen any difference in terms of the effectiveness of your message since you've been, attempting this tack? I mean, I know that you probably among everybody else has always been one of the most thoughtful people on the left in terms of what you're doing, and I think, look, when I first started, you were one of the only channels that I watched when I was first getting into political commentary on YouTube. So this is, to your credit, you've always been consistently, I think, pushing a more measured, reasonable, nuanced take, which the internet doesn't always reward. I don't know if the internet is best known for nuance these days. But have you found that it's been effective, even in anecdotal dealings with folks, with viewers who consume your content, in terms of bringing people over who may be independent, may have voted for Trump himself?
I think that anecdotally, that's absolutely happening. And, one of the things that can be difficult is filtering out the noise for the signal. As your audience grows, the amount of feedback starts to go up, and it becomes difficult to really figure out what's the signal here and what is the noise. But one of the things that I try to do is I really see the platform I've built, and I know, with your platform, you see it the same way. There is a level of responsibility that comes with it. And so what I find myself doing is really thinking zooming out a little bit and saying, what is the important message? You know, whenever I capture someone's attention, even if it's for 15 seconds on TikTok or a couple of minutes on YouTube or whatever it is, what's the really important takeaway here? And what is the takeaway that will get this person now to maybe take an action to improve their community? And really thinking about the platform I've built as a tool with which to affect that kind of change. That's not the way it was 8 years ago, you know, when I was much earlier in doing this with a much smaller audience.
Yeah. What's the most memorable part of the book in your opinion?
Well, there's an entire section of countries that have figured out a lot of the things we struggle with here.
Yeah.
And the cliche is always Scandinavia, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, Denmark, things are fine in Denmark, fine. But there's more stories in the book. We look at Uruguay in South America. We look at Portugal in Europe during the 2010s. We look at the Kerala state in India. And there's this idea that sometimes people fall for in the US when Republicans go, we're too big of a country to use this sort of solution. We're too diverse of a country to use the solution that Sweden used. And I debunk each of those and basically tell people, worst case, as states, we can do all the stuff that these other countries are doing. Even if you fall for 340 million people, it's too big a country to do some of this stuff. Approach a lot of these things at the state level, and they are doable and they are solvable. And I think that's one of the strongest parts of the book.